There were a lot of popular SNES games that came out back in the first half of the 90s decade, but I'm going to focus on Mother 2, aka Earthbound, which came out back in 1995. And when this game was released in America, it was not as popular as Nintendo probably hoped it would be. And it's probably because the game didn't really connect with Americans during that time period, 95 onwards, and it's due to a couple of things actually. One, in 1995, more people were turning to the PS1 and the Sega Saturn, and the following year in '96, people were turning to the N64 for a better gaming experience in terms of graphics and for mainly for 3D gameplay, because I guess people were getting sick of 2D gameplay to some extent by 1995. The second reason why Mother 2 probably wasn't as popular in America as Nintendo had hoped it would be was because America never got to see the release of Mother 1 in the United States, and because of that, it feels like Mother 2 was a game that I guess a lot of people didn't really connect with because they never played the first Mother game, and that kind of raised a question on whether or not Mother 1 should have been ported for the SNES sometime between 91 and 93, sometime in the early 90s, because like having a remastered version of Mother 1 on the SNES would have been a great way to introduce a lot of people to the series prior to the release of Mother 2. In fact, I think that's what should have been done, and more people probably would have been able to be emotionally invested in the game a lot better than they would have been if they just played Mother 2 without playing Mother 1. In fact, the setting for Mother 2 takes place about a decade after the events from Mother 1, and Mother 1 was a game that nobody really played outside of Japan, and it's a game that it may not have been as popular as Mother 2 was, but at the same time, it's a game that looked pretty interesting, and it was one that I feel could have been more popular than it was if it was released, outside of Japan for the NES, or at least ported for the SNES sometime during the early 90s, because by the time we got to 1995, I guess 2D RPGs were starting to get played out to some extent. A lot of people were switching over towards 3D and 3D gaming and all that stuff. In fact, if Mother 2 came out a couple of years sooner, sometime between 91 93, even without Mother 1, it's quite possible that Mother 2 could have been more popular than it was. I mean, if you look at games like, I don't know, Secret of Mana and, other RPGs that came out back in the early 90s before 95, if those games came out any later than they did, it's quite possible that they may not have been as popular as they were, probably with the only exception being like Chrono Trigger, which I believe came out in 95, and that game was highly successful, but it was a Square Enix game, and Square Enix makes great JRPGs. So Square Enix is probably Square Enix could have made 2D JRPGs up until 97, 98, and they probably still would have been huge attractions to some extent if they were on the SNES. But as far as Mother 1 not being released in America, I feel like that had a lot to do with the lack of success that Mother 2 had back in the mid 90s. And in some ways, Mother 2 is actually considered to be one of the best JRPGs from the 16-bit era. A lot of people look back at it now as a cult classic, and it was a game that was very unique due to its art style and its gameplay. And the game had a pretty dark plot, but yet it managed to stay family friendly. So a nice balance between those two aspects kind of made Earthbound an attractive JRPG. And it's a shame that Mother 1 was never it never received the SNES release, because you look back at what Nintendo did with the first three Mario games, the Super Mario Brothers trilogy that was on the NES, between the which came, I believe, the trilogy came out between um, 1985 and 1988, because Super Mario Brothers 1 came out in 1985, Super Mario Brothers 3 came out in 1990 or 1988, I believe. So Nintendo basically re-released all three of those games in an additional game, Super Mario Lost Levels, on the SNES back in the early 90s. I believe it may have been 1993. And because of that, those who never got to play the original Super Mario Brothers games on the NES got a chance to play it on the SNES, and that's something that Nintendo should have done with Mother One. They should have re-released. They should have done that with more games, to be honest. They probably should have done that with the first three Castlevania games that came out before, or right, either before or after Super Castlevania 4 was released in '91. Because if you never played or you never owned an NES and you had an SNES and you played Super Castlevania 4 for the first time, you're kind of like lost in terms of what's going on and about the series and all that stuff. So it's kind of hard to get emotionally invested into playing, certain games. But as far as plot is concerned, the plot in Mother 2 was not, I don't think it was directly connected to Mother One, but the events following Mother One was basically emphasized in Mother Two, and you still had the same main character Ness and all that stuff. So I feel like Nintendo definitely should have released a 16-bit version of Mother One. Whether or not that would have had a huge impact on whether or not Mother 2 would have been as big or more popular than it ended up becoming when it was released in America, who knows? But I honestly feel that the Mother series definitely had the potential to be a lot bigger than it was, because you look at Mother 3, which I believe came out on Game Boy Advance during the mid 2000s, 2006, I believe. For whatever reason, that remained a Japanese exclusive as well up until I believe it was eventually released in America, but it remained a Japanese exclusive for the Game Boy Advance. And the funny thing about that is the Game Boy Advance was something that people kind of moved on from, because a lot of people were starting to play the Nintendo DS, which was starting to become the new handheld game system that everybody was buying back from like 2004 onward. So having Mother 3 as a Game Boy Advance exclusive didn't really make too much sense either. But it always seemed like, Nintendo really didn't place too much emphasis on the Mother series. I mean, I believe when Mother 2 came out, there was a marketing campaign that was kind of strange, and basically $2 million went behind into marketing Mother 2, and it seemed like it didn't really matter because a lot of people just weren't into it as much as I guess Nintendo hoped that they would be into it when it first came out. So, not to say that, Mother 2 is a bad game, because it's not. It's a pretty good JRPG. The thing is, it should have been released a lot sooner than it was, and its prequel should have had an SNES port at some point before the release of Mother 2.